Hi all, my name is Anna Strömberg and I want to welcome you all to this recorded webinar in which we'll hear about the corona pandemic effects of the geopolitical climate, environmental policy making, and in what ways Sweden will fundamentally change as a consequence of this crisis. The webinar is jointly arranged by Swesif, the Swedish Forum for Sustainable Investments, and Mistra, the Swedish Foundation for Environmental Strategic Research. I represent Swesif as a part of the board, and Swesif is an independent membership fee-funded association founded in 2003, and it has just over 100 members, most of whom are asset owners and asset managers. Our purpose is to act as a network and meeting point for sustainable investments in Sweden, where we exchange insights and experience to increase knowledge and contribute to the public debate. We do this through arranging seminars, roundtables, membership lunches, etc. on current issues. It's especially interesting and fruitful when we can join forces between the business side of sustainability with science. And we're very happy with our close relationship with Mistra. And with that, I'll hand over to Åsa Moberg to say a few words about Mistra.
Thank you, Anna. Yes, Mistra, the Swedish Foundation for Strategic Environmental Research, is a funder of inter- and transdisciplinary research that shall be of importance for finding solutions to important environmental problems and for sustainable development of society. And this determination to drive positive change is key to Mistra, also as an asset owner. And our dual roles as research funder and asset owner give Mistra a great opportunity to provide a bridge between the finance sector and academic researchers. This can provide for new perspectives and increased knowledge. So joint webinars with Swesif, as this one, is such an opportunity. The members of the panel in today's webinar are all researchers in the research program Mistra Geopolitics. And the moderator of today's webinar is Mattias Sundling, Chief Equity Strategist at Danske Bank. Welcome, Mattias. We now look forward to the coming discussions.
My name is Mattias Sundling from Danske Bank. I've done numerous seminars over the years, but never like this, so hopefully everything will work. We have a big agenda, many questions, and we'll try to squeeze as much as possible in, but we will also try to honor the schedule, which says that we should be done by 11 today. So let me first of all then introduce the panel we have with us today, a distinguished one, and I'm going to ask you guys to then turn on the cameras as I introduce you, so we can all get a chance to say hi to you. So first of all, our first participant today is Mr. Karl Hallding, Senior Research Fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute. Say hi, Karl.
Hello, everyone.
And welcome. Then we have Jiayi, who's a researcher at the Climate Change and Risk Program at SIPRI. Let's see if we can get you to join. There you are. Hi, welcome. And finally, also Mr. Björn-Ola Linnér, Professor of Environmental Change at the Center for Climate Science and Policy Research at the Linköping University. Are you with us, Björn-Ola?
Hello. Don't you see me? Yeah. Did I appear?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Great.
Yes, we see you. Great. Okay. So we're going to focus on three major questions today. We're going to talk about this corona pandemic, and we're going to put it into sort of a perspective of the geopolitical impact, the environmental impact, and also how it affects Sweden as a country more specifically. But let's just kick off with a few sort of observations here. And let me just state a couple of trends, things that were happening before this hit. We had populism rising, we had nationalism rising, we had a feeling that globalization was in reverse, we had protectionism coming from that, we had this issue of immigration that was getting more and more attention, and of course the whole issue of ESG and the green environment. We had the Greta becoming a superstar. We had digitalization on top of that, and also in the background looming this thing with China sort of a rising superpower. All these trends, and I'm just throwing out this question to all of you guys to start off with. Do you think that this corona is an accelerator, or is it something that will reverse this, or doesn't it matter for these major trends? Björn-Ola, what do you think?
Well, I think we must realize that we will see both. It will be, some of these trends will, in parts of the world, will be reinforced, but in other parts of the world, we will see them maybe maybe unfolding otherwise. But we can go into details. We will discuss the role of China. I think in parts it will, their influence will increase, but also we will see the importance of other countries like Vietnam and others as sites of production will increase. When it comes to the green issues, I'm quite certain that we will see, actually, this would spur transformation, especially like in Europe and in parts of the US and so on. Whereas in other parts of the world, we see a reverse trend.
Okay. What about you, Karl? Do you think does this matter? Does it have an impact on these processes?
Well, let's say in a few years, we thought that the financial crisis 10 years ago would have a major impact. It had a sort of an impact. I think some of the trends that you mentioned before, Mattias, were actually set off then. But in a sense, it was more of a blip. Things came back to normal after a few years. So actually, we don't know. It's a lot of uncertainties about what we could foresee in terms of disruptive trends that were kind of triggered by or amplified by the corona crisis. Yeah. My observation is that I think that we learned to use webinars for meetings, and I don't think that the aviation business will come back again. I think it's so much more effective to have meetings like this for some types of meetings. So that's one kind of disruptive trend I think will stay on.
Yeah. Let's hope today proves that point then. Jiayi, any thoughts, any gut feelings on what the impact will be?
Yeah, so I really appreciate the other two panelists' very nuanced responses. I think, though, for now, amidst the coronavirus, what I feel has happened for the time being has been an acceleration of those trends. You see economic nationalism, you see the exacerbation of geopolitical fault lines. Green transformation, of course, is there. Digitalization is certainly there. Actually, the one thing that I would put some reservations on is whether or not China's rise as a superpower is unequivocal. I think that there's a lot that can be said there, which we can get into later.
Yeah, we're going to come back to that. I'm just going to ask for the first chart. We're not going to have many charts here, but let me just look at the first chart if you can have that up. And I stole this from you, Björn-Ola, because you have this as a sort of a way of categorizing changes, right? Let's see if we can see it. So would you like to walk us through very quickly? What are we looking at here?
Well, yeah, it's a lot of talk today on transformation, that we need society transformation. It's actually the tagline of the 2030 agenda, as people who do sustainability are well aware of. But it's also the major goal for the European Green Deal, for instance. But when we dissect what people envision in terms of society transformation, I think we can group them into 4 categories. Those that will happen very rapidly and are targeting the whole world, the whole culture, a global agenda like the 2030. That's what we call a quantum leap approach. And then there are those global trends that are more emergent, happening slowly over time. I mean, the 2030 agenda should happen in 15 years. We have only 10 years left. It remains to be seen how we succeed with the transformation in that regard. But then on the other hand, you have the more compartmentalized, or particular segments of society that is not spanning the whole globe or whole culture, but perhaps different segments of society, different sectors and so on. And those could also be then categorized into those that happen really fast, the convergent ones, and those that gradually evolve over time.
Okay, and very, very quickly, if we look upon this corona pandemic as a natural disaster, where do you think, in what quadrant would you put us? I know it's a tough question, I know.
It's a tough one, yeah. where we really will see transformation, that is non-linear changes in the systems, structural changes. I think it will be convergence, but I think it would also give an impetus to more gradual ones. But as we started saying, I don't think this will be global phenomena. I think that we will see different trajectories in different parts of the world.
Yeah. Okay. So great. So that leads us then into the first question, which means that I would like to get the second chart here. If we can have that. And while we wait for that, which is just basically an image to lead us into the first question, which is the one on geopolitical impact. So we touched upon this, Jiayi. Okay, so China, is this the thing that really puts China into its sort of finally puts them among superpowers, or what do you think? What are your feelings here?
Yeah, I think just a few days ago, the EU High Representative mentioned that this is really perhaps a turning point where you might see the arrival of this so-called Asian century. I think, however, whether or not China is a superpower depends on how you define superpower, really. Certainly on the economics, China is, rebounding, and it's looking to continue to grow in terms of its weight and its clout on that front. But it's also important to note that the centennial goal of reaching a moderately prosperous society, that was still reaching, a GDP that was maybe about a sixth in per capita terms to the US. So while it's enough to make it already distinct from, let's say, developing countries, it's also to say that poverty alleviation is on the Chinese domestic political agenda in a way that's not the case for OECD countries. If you were to define it by military issues, I would say, of course, China right now, it's the second largest military spender, but it's also important to note that a significant amount of resources go into internal security, and that front there's a lot of issues for China to grapple with internally, whether or not that's Xinjiang, whether or not that's Hong Kong. You might put Taiwan in that category as well. And then I think there are a multitude of other factors that comprise what you might call superpower. And I think one of the most important ones is the ability to summon alliances, to bring people together, to coordinate, to sort of buttress the multilateral system. And while, it sort of reached a peak after the election of Trump and, Xi Jinping's speech at Davos, I think since that period of time, it's been more and more of a backlash against China. I think it's not clear that China has the normative clout to really buttress a rules-based system, and that it's a rules-based system that really aligns with countries like the US or the EU. If you look at its grand initiatives that have tried to reach out and bring a more sort of called a community of common destiny, such as the Belt and Road Initiative, some of these mega projects, they've had some diplomatic and some policy success in terms of the politics and the diplomacy in some developing countries. But in the two regions that China is most dependent on in terms of trade and investment, the US and the EU, I mean, you see more and more in the past couple of years that there's a tremendous backlash against that, even in the Central and Eastern European countries. So on these issues, I would say that I wouldn't call it superpower. I don't think that's the right term, because that also depends on the response of the rest of the world. And right now it's very, very mixed.
But if you look at this specific event, this pandemic, would you say that it has, and the way it's been managed by China, because there's a bit of a backlash there too, right? So would you say that have China, put it this way, during the financial crisis, you could make the point that China sort of took the opportunity to step forward. Do you get the same feeling this time, or is it more that they blundered a little?
I think there's no question that there were blunders in the initial kind of the initial stages of the coronavirus. That's very clear in terms of what they reported to the WHO and et cetera, and the things that went on inside the country. But here's where there's, I think there's still some things playing out. The narrative is changing, almost weekly. I think if you were just to go back 1 month ago, a lot of pundits, a lot of analysts were saying, China looks to have emerged from this a relative winner. It's been able to sell this narrative that, our governance system has been able to handle this in a way that perhaps, they might argue even democracies have not, although I would say the East Asian countries that are democracies are a counterexample. But even now, that's also been reversed. So even some of this, PPE diplomacy that they've been deploying in certain countries in Europe, even that has had its limits. See that as the EU has stepped up its response on the pandemic, that those countries that were so susceptible to Chinese aid on this issue before are turning back into the fold. So I would say it still needs some time, but I think it's a very mixed picture, and I think it's actually polarizing people in a way that makes it clear that China won't come out of this unequivocally one way or the other. Yeah.
Okay. What about another big player then on the political stage, so to speak, on the EU? Karl, what are your thoughts here? Because every time there's a crisis, you have this feeling that they're on the verge of falling apart or breaking up, and then with a gun to their heads, they come together and they, I don't know, we'll see today there's a recovery fund in the making here, but what are your thoughts? Does the EU come stronger out of this or more disintegrated?
Well, I think there is a lot of uncertainty and about where EU is going here, and for sure you could say that EU is put to a test here. Initially, there were a lot of problems in terms of borders closing and not sharing the burden of the corona pandemic across the EU countries, the member states. But if you look back, you see that EU has had the ability to come together in terms of crisis, and that it has actually forged EU into a stronger body, one way or another.
You think that's what's happening now? Are they coming together now? Is that what you're saying?
I think it's too early to tell. I think a lot of these things are still in the cards. But if you start to look at the more, if you started to dig into and unpack what's happening in the EU, I think one thing is that as Jiayi, you have certain countries in the EU, particularly in the southern and eastern part of the EU, where China has had more of an influence in terms of lending money and providing support after the financial crisis 10 years ago. And then you have the more stronger countries in the EU where you have more of the traditional heartland of EU. So one way to look at this is you see a kind of center and periphery development of EU with a stronger center on a weaker periphery. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is, of course, that EU comes together better, and it reforges the whole of EU as a result of the pandemic. Yet another opportunity is that it falls apart. That this is the start of a much weaker EU, both internally and on the world stage.
Yeah. But I think Björn-Ola wants a word here. But let me just ask you before I let Björn-Ola in. This agreement between Merkel and Macron. Any thoughts on that? Is that a make or break moment? It's been hailed as the huge step forward on mutualization of fiscal policy and so forth. Very quickly, would you agree with that?
One of those examples of how EU comes together in terms of crisis. But we don't know where it goes. But I think it's one of those examples of how EU is gathering speed and the leading countries of EU come together in terms of crisis to try to bring the whole thing together.
Yeah. Björn-Ola.
Yes, of course, we don't know yet, but I think there are three reasons to expect that the EU will go strengthened out of this crisis in spite of what happened initially and in spite of some disintegrating tendencies that Karl had talked about. And one is the need for being prepared for crisis like this, and that we need to work on vaccines, we need to have a better infrastructure to be prepared for crisis. We also see that the food security issues surface, but it's also emphasized that together as a union, we can be more robust for crisis in the future. So I think that argument will work towards more strengthening the EU than disintegrating it. The other is that we have in the autumn we had the Green Deal as launched as where the EU is seen as needed for a structural response for the climate crisis, and now we see with the discussions which you just mentioned with the deal with Macron and Merkel that EU is also seen as needed for structural responses in times of crisis like this. And this is something that is agreed upon even in the East European countries that are skeptical to some of the Green Deal issues. So I think that also speaks for strengthening the EU in the future. And also when we've seen sort of the responses that we've seen from especially the United States, I think that is a realization we can't counter the United States by falling apart. That I would just like to emphasize one thing more. We often see that EU is hard to agree and that we quarrel and are we disintegrating now and so on. But look at the US. They're constantly struggling and arguing among the states as well between the federal level and the state level. So this is not unique for EU. I mean, this is what comes with large political organizations. I can answer how it is in China, but I'm sure with a little bit more freedom of speech and we would see the same tendencies in China if we don't do it already.
And I'm already running above my schedule here, but I have one more question for you, Jiayi, on China. This thing that happened in Hong Kong, for example, is that an example of how China uses this opportunity to push forward an agenda that they had in the back of their head, and then they see the opportunity here as when we all are occupied by other things? Or would this legislation proposal for Hong Kong happen regardless of the corona? What do you think? Jiayi, I think you need to unmute.
I'm so sorry. Yeah. So I mean, my impression, which is not based on deep insider information or anything, is that this is legislation in direct response to the protests that took place. So I wouldn't connect it directly to opportunism as a result of the coronavirus, but I think it certainly plays to China's advantage that most of the other countries are preoccupied right now with other factors. I think going forward, I think this feeds into I think part of this tense narrative that's emerging on whether or not China is a responsible stakeholder. So I think in this sense, I'm not sure if it's also going to feed into the backlash as well. I think it will.
Okay. We have to rush forward here. We have a tight schedule, but maybe we'll come back to this. So let's just jump into one of the key questions here, which is of course the environmental impact. We have a little chart, I think, highlighting that, which is the third slide, if I'm not wrong. So I don't know. Yeah, can we move to the third slide, Eileen?
It's there. I think it's showing right now.
Oh, it does? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, whatever. So, Björn-Ola, okay, here we have it, just as an introduction. Okay, so this is before and after, so to speak, of the corona. There's obviously an immediate and huge impact on the way the world looks right now. I saw Maria Wetterstrand, who used to be one of the spokesperson for the Green Party here in Sweden, who said this was not the way we wanted, a clean environment. So where does this leave us, do you think? Will the green movement, will it be strengthened by what's going on right now, or do you think that this is the opposite, that people are terrified that they connect a blue sky with a dead economy. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, well, I think that in the short term, that might well be we will see a backlash. I mean, for sure, we already see that in many countries. I think in China, new figures show that the emissions are on the rise quite rapidly. But if we talk about transformations, we must remember that it's not only about new technologies or innovations that will help us to save the climate, but it's also about reorganization of society, institutions, so on, but also on perspective shifts. If we look historically, there is no major societal transformation that has occurred without new technology shifts, but also no transformation that has occurred without perspective shifts. And I think in the long term, this will be very important to show what the world could look like if we address it in the right way. Well, it shows how dependent our economy is on pollution. So in the short term, of course, we will see a backlash, but I think in the long term, I think it will open up for a legitimacy for renewable energy policies or more stringent policies when it comes to urban pollutions and so on. And I would see that in the countries that are a little bit on the richer scale, that we clearly see at least some commitment that we should not go back to things that were previously. Even Madrid, for instance, who now talk about we should not go back to the situation that Madrid was in terms of pollution before the crisis. So, and we see that in several cities around the world. So I think it's an empty for a change.
In that sense, what's going on right now, it's a good example. It's a template, in your view, for the public opinion, rather than a scare.
Yeah, I think everybody realizes that this is not what is intended for the transformation. I think that's quite clear. I see the risk, but I think that's quite clear.
Yeah, but this is a stupid question, perhaps. But I mean, if you take Greta, for example, will she return? I mean, I haven't seen an article or a headline with Greta in it for weeks and months. Will she return to superstardom, or is, you know, as an influencer? Sure.
I mean, I think it was destined that she would. This is like all moments that have a figurehead. I mean, for a while they are in the limelight, and then the media interest disappears. But what has happened, I think, was that the movement, sort of the school strike movement, the Fridays for the Future, is not only Greta. Now it's clear that is a much more robust social movement, and I think that will go on. We will see that won't disappear with this. Rather, they will be on the toes as soon as they can go out on the street again to demand that the recoveries are done in a climate-friendly manner.
Yeah. So let's just touch upon this idea of sort of supranational governance. Jiayi, the Paris Accord, the US left that and so forth, and it seems to me now during the corona here that everyone is on their own, so to speak. Everyone is grabbing medical supplies, and everyone has their own restrictions and all rules. And the whole idea of supranational governance, or these governmental bodies, are they strengthened, or what do you think is going to happen here?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think one thing you mentioned that should be highlighted is the US. And there are elections, coming in November that are really going to determine this whole acceleration, blip, continuity picture over the medium term and long term, and are also going to impact the state of multilateralism. But for now, it seems very, very shaky grounds. I think one of the major impacts is this idea of positive sum logics, of economic liberalism, of international cooperation that's really been displaced by the idea that we all individually need to engage in risk mitigation and diversification of our vulnerabilities, of our suppliers, etc. And I think in terms of the institutions, It's not only the World Health Organization, it's not only the World Trade Organization, it's also even the UN Security Council, where they can't even come up with a resolution on a ceasefire at this period of time. So I think across a range of these kinds of institutions, you're seeing these unilateralism, this free-for-all, beggar-thy-neighbor policy, you're seeing them play out, I think, for sure. In terms of
right now, the corona has sort of pushed that even further, so to speak.
I would say so, but I mean, you never know if a new American administration comes and it tends to reverse that trend. That's possible, but and you might see sort of new life if the U.S. rejoins the Paris Agreement, for example. We don't know that yet. But I think what's interesting for me as an analyst is the idea that it's not just politics anymore. There's this sort of more structural conversation about what is risk, about what is the strategic sector. You know, what are we willing to allow international and supranational institutions, what kind of powers will we allow them to have? And I think for the time being, it's a kind of a scary picture.
Yeah. So there's this idea, I think, which is a fair point, I guess, and I would like your take on this, Karl, that with this crisis, there was this enormous sense of urgency. So you had these almost unimaginable amounts of money available in the shape, both from central banks and from fiscal policies. You have, and I mean, put this forward myself. In my view, we've taken the whole policy response from the great financial crisis, doubled it, and squeezed it in on 6 weeks or something like that. So I guess if you're really sort of active on green issues here, I guess the question would be, why was all this funding available on such a short notice when we were squabbling and arguing about the Green Deal and how to finance that? And what are your thoughts around that?
Well, to begin with, I haven't done the calculations, but my hunch is that the money that has been put up, you know, from governments to deal with the corona pandemic is far more than the total bill for, you know, doing the Paris Agreement or something like that. I'm not sure you could really compare it like that, but I mean, in terms of financial efforts, I think that those are, you know, comparable at the very least. But we have to realize that although the climate crisis on the longer term is definitely a lot worse, a much bigger challenge for the global society than the corona pandemic, it plays out on the longer term, and apparently this pandemic has kind of triggered a lot of very strong reactions in terms of willingness to take on costs, very high costs.
But do you think it will sort of ignite the idea that, or it has, put it this way, it has demonstrated that if there is a sense of urgency, you know, you can do basically anything. And will that be used as an argument, do you think, when things cool down and we start to look at the green issues and the Green Deal and how to finance and everything? You know, look what you did 2 weeks ago on that one. Why can't you do it here? Would you think it's?
Yeah, but the argument is already out there. So, but I think you know, currently it's a treacherous argument to make because people are dying, and you know, the public debate so far is very much in line with, you know, saving lives. But I think this whole, you know, question about economy versus lives, and whether or not to open up the economies, and the cost in terms of lives there, and how to open up the economies, and where should we put the money, what type of infrastructure should we build if we try to stimulate our economies. Is it like going back to normal? Is it plugging holes, or is it like restructuring, seeing a type of new world reappearing? These are very interesting questions. I don't have an answer to them, but for sure, I mean, the arguments are out there, but we need to wait a bit for the pandemic to cool down before those arguments are coming out in play.
But I'm asking Björn-Ola and Karl here, so you have to shout out the loudest here.
Yeah, sure.
But would you say, let's look at the Green Deal then, for example, which was a very ambitious and long-term program and so forth. Do you think that the probability that this will happen and get some sort of public money behind it has increased or decreased? Because in one way, we're going to come out of this with huge public debts to begin with. We're just bridging and covering people loss of income right now. So, and we're going to end up with a public debt of 120 or 130 or something like that in EU. So that would be against it, right? Or on the other hand, as I said, it has illustrated that if you really want to, and if there's a sense of urgency, the money can be there. So what do you think, Björn-Ola? Which one is going to happen here?
The first one, I think now we already have new budget rules within the EU that we didn't think would happen. So I think, well, of course, it will be a tough battle between some countries in the EU, how much debt the EU can have. But I definitely think the chances are greater for the European Green Deal. I mean, the finance of the European Green Deal was the most difficult thing a couple of months ago or a half a year ago, and now we can see that those resources can be raised. And I also think the importance of the European Green Deal has increased because that's a positive vision of where we want to go. I think there is something that we must bear in mind is that the recovery is seen as an investment because the cost without the response will be much worse. When it comes to a more abstract thing like future cost of climate change, that's much harder to use that avoidance argument. Then we need to create the positive visions instead. If we make these investments, we will come out much better, regardless of the worst case scenarios that we also have to anticipate.
Do you agree, Karl?
I think it's
more likely there will be a Green Deal than not be a Green Deal from this. This has pushed it forward.
No, I agree with Björn-Ola. I mean, the kind of financial resources that were thought of as the backbone of the Green Deal are not really there anymore. So I think from that perspective, there is more of a problem to roll it out as it was thought of. I think on the other hand, I think we need to look at what type of new new trajectories that the corona pandemic has set us off on, and it's a new world. It might be a new world. As I said initially, my hunch is that airlines will see very, very different future when we have these type of meetings. People, companies see opportunities for productivity gains by holding these type of meetings instead of sending people around the world. Save money, save time. So that drives productivity. And that type of train, things that are happening not because we have certain values, but because of its sheer, economic argument. Those things are going to change the world, and the actors that see that change and could, change in order to comply with that type of future, those are the winners in the future. So I think it's much more of a matter of things happening, with market forces and the ability to actually read the tea leaves and see where is the world going and where should we hedge, where should we put our money.
Jiayi, can I just ask you in China, because I think China at least every now and then try to sort of portray itself as an advocate of green issues as well, right? But now they're also struggling with a faltering economy. And I always had the sense that at the end of the day, delivering wealth was sort of the key thing for the Chinese government. Where do you think this leads them? Will they sort of quietly drop the environmental issues, or will they continue to advocate them? Yes, Karl, I see you. I will let you in, but first, Jiayi.
Yeah, maybe Karl has a lot more interesting things to say about this, but I've taken a look at also, I mean, recently the stimulus package that was that they announced. A lot of it looks like business as usual in terms of sort of investments in infrastructure, you know, local government kind of debt rising, and these kinds of projects are going to be about the economy. They're going to be about jobs. They're going to be about raising these kind of more economic indicators. They're not really going to be about putting the environment at the center of a real transformative shift. I wouldn't say that this issue would drop off. I doubt that's this whole narrative of ecological civilization and the other policy measures that are still being put forward and will continue to be put forward on environmental issues. Those are important, but as Karl might know, these are domestic policies, and I think China's environmental footprint globally, I think, also encompasses its investments abroad, a lot of which are still internally as well. I mean, some of them are in fossil fuels, in extractives, so or dirty industries. So that's still important.
Yeah. Karl?
Yeah, what we see right now, and what I heard from companies that are in the business of providing inputs for you know, infrastructure development around the world, machinery and so on. There's a surge now in China. Market is great for, you know, machines for you know, build infrastructure. So apparently the floodgates are open now in funding within China for building things, just building things because that's a way of that's in the backbone of Chinese planners, you know, to get the economy working. So it's building whatever, not necessarily green things, just building things, infrastructure. If you look internationally and globally, China is the biggest financer of new coal power around the world. So the odd thing is that if you look at the financial these things are dressed up as green investments. If you ask people in China, is coal green? Yeah, coal could be green because the best coal is green. The whole Belt and Road Initiative is green, but 80% of it, if you look back 10 years, is fossil fuel. It's fossil fuel investments. It's not even the best coal power. It's just standard coal power. So I think we need to look beyond the rhetorics of Chinese you know, policy, scratch the surface of that and really call the bluff, because it is a bluff.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Maybe we should. Let's see what time it is. Yeah. Let's move on then to the final question here. We can come back to the other things, and let me just point out here that there is a possibility for you guys who listen in to ask questions to the panel. So you do that through the chat function, supposedly. Don't be shy, do that. Okay, so let's just briefly touch upon the third topic then, which is how Sweden will change. I don't know if we can get the fourth and final slide up showing. It's an image I found. Let me see here. Yeah, this one, which looks really gloomy and scary, someone pointed out. But the point is, this is supposedly an inventory that we used to have filled with medicines. And it's empty now because we don't, after the Cold War ended, we didn't think we needed to have those kind of inventories anymore. But so I guess this is just one example on how things might change. I don't know. I'm asking you guys in the panel here. Will we be a different country after this? On this, for example, will we return to a more of a Cold War mentality? Will we start to stockpiling medicines or vaccines or food? What are your thoughts? Björn-Ola?
Yeah, well, as we talked before, yeah, in part, I think definitely we will think more about our local food supplies and so on, that we ensure that we will have a more robust society in Sweden. But I think the emphasis as the planning begins will be more on having this preparedness within the EU and make sure that the EU has logistics and rules in place to make sure that we can cover it within the EU. That would be my hunch. But definitely we will see a different world in that respect, and it will be interesting to see how it plays out for an export-dependent country like Sweden, because of course we can say that, okay, we should have more security here, we should close the loops, which we need to do for environmental reasons, for many respects. But on the other hand, we are very keen to keep the global trade going, because otherwise our economy will be restructured in a way that will be difficult for Sweden.
But we'll come back to that. But let's just, Karl, what do you think here? Let's just stay with my first question. Will we go back to the Cold War structure, which is a cost? I mean, that's a cost to society. I mean, we talked about the peace dividend when the war came down. Will we sort of have to pay that back and start to rebuild a lot of unproductive resources just in case something happens? What do you think?
I think that's definitely in the cards. To have on the balance, to have more of redundancy in the systems, so to make sure that we have those stockpiles that we need, that we have basic security, food security, for example, food supply and things like that. I think other countries will argue similarly. So we will. I'm quite sure we will go back to something which is less reliant on sort of collective market-based supplies, and where you have rather you secure your supplies, and whether or not that's nations or companies. I think everyone will look for their supply chains. Try to secure them and make them less vulnerable to different types of events. And as you said, that's a cost. So it will reduce the opportunity for global growth. So I think one thing that we will need to prepare for is lower growth globally, and how that will distribute among countries in the world. That probably means less opportunity for growth for more wealthy countries, and I think we need to be prepared for zero growth, negative growth, periods like that. Do we have the policies, the fiscal policies? Are we prepared for that? Because I think we've been used since 50 years back or more to have decent global growth, and that each year we have a certain amount of growth. We have like 1 or 2 or 3% growth at least. I don't think we will have that. I think our policymakers need to be preparing for another type of a global economy.
Yeah, and we touched upon it, but just in the business sector, I mean, all of these companies have invested heavily. The big multinationals have invested heavily in these global supply chains with just-in-time deliveries and really slim inventories. I mean, the inventories are basically in trucks on the road constantly. Will we see a backlash there as well, Björn-Ola?
I'm not sure. I've seen, this is not my area of expertise, but I've seen quite a lot of discussion on that maybe the just-in-time strategy is not that environmentally bad, because it's a lot of resources that go into keeping stockpiles as well. And I mean, it depends on, of course, we will see a great turn towards the basic needs in life that can be secured. But when it comes to companies, their supply chains and so on, I don't really see that would be an economy going back to keeping a lot of to secure the production, because that would be a huge cost. And when technology development happens so fast, how do you know what you would really store, what you will need in over 5 or 10 years time? So I'm not sure.
Okay.
I would be less certain that would actually be the case. I think that's what we perhaps discussed now. But I also think that we already now see that many economies are bouncing back and the production is increasing and so on. So I think the worst case scenarios have not unfolded, and that would not. So yeah, I will be a bit out.
Fine, but just final point about Sweden, just as an example, will we have much more local food production? And would that fit into that the green discussion as well?
Yeah, and that's, I mean, because that makes economically sense, I think, over time, because we will need to go that way anyway when it comes to sustainability issues and so on. So that, I think, will be a very tangible outcome from more so than in the industrial production and so on, I think.
Yeah. And Karl, how would that happen? Will it happen? You mentioned the market forces. Will market forces enable us to produce and grow more food here locally, or how will it happen? Through regulation, or?
Many of these things were happening before the corona pandemic. The strength of globalization has been, on retreat since WTO lost its momentum in the Doha rounds. That's more than 10 years ago. We've seen the world changing into more bilateral trade agreements and now trade wars. And so I think there is a larger global geo-economical thing happening here, which plays in with this type of more local sourcing, more you depend more on your local resource base and so on. So when it comes to food, I'm sure the market forces are there to guide us and help us into that. I think it's in the cards, definitely.
Okay.
And I think that's quite good, actually.
Yeah.
By and large, yeah.
5 minutes left of the schedule. We actually got a couple of questions, so I'm going to read a couple of them out loud here. And the first one goes like this. We talk a lot about the possibilities of green investments where views are divided. But no matter what you believe about investments being made, funding will almost certainly come from carbon taxes, emission trading, etc. More stick than carrot, but still something the business sector need to adapt to, right? What do you guys think? Is that still what's in the future?
Well,
go ahead, Karl.
Yeah, I would like to. No, I'm not sure it's like that. I think if whether or not what we call green investments are happening, it depends to a certain extent on regulation and policy, but it also depends on movement on the market. So I would just like to take the example of hybrid, the joint venture between SSAB, LKAB, and Vattenfall to make steel, without using coal at all. That's a decision taken on pure market basis. It's about where these companies want to be in the market in 20 years from now. I think we see a lot of that type of movements, and that's what we should keep our eyes on.
Björn-Ola?
No, yeah, I agree. I think what we made a large media survey on the responses, where it's currently ongoing. But what we can see initially, it's all English and French-speaking press globally. And what we can see, one thing that stands out is the emphasis on investments. The response is new investments. So I think that's part of the discourse, a much more willingness and legitimacy of new large-scale investment endeavors, and the role of the state, that the state is important, even though the papers or new articles point out that the businesses are essential, of course, because it's all about saving the businesses and let them thriving after the COVID response. The state as an actor guaranteeing large-scale, long-term, deep structural investments is essential. So now we see a greater willingness to not only work with market mechanism to fund climate initiatives, but also to use sort of tax money, the finances of the governments to make large-scale investments. So much more. We'll see if that plays out and if it makes sense or not. That's another issue. But we see a legitimacy for those type of investments guaranteed by the states in collaboration with often large companies. It's something.
What are your thoughts here, Jiayi, on the Chinese businesses? Is it stick or carrot? Or I mean, there's some high-profile products like the electrification of vehicles and stuff like that. China has taken the lead, so to speak. But will that gain momentum from here or lose momentum? Do you think?
You mean the electric vehicle markets, or
no, just in general? I mean, how does the Chinese business community act? Will they need a stick or is it a carrot that drives them in their thinking around the green questions?
Well, I mean, subsidies have always played a big role in stimulating and incentivizing companies to act in a certain way. So I think that's going to continue to be the case in terms of policy. But I might actually, if I could just jump in on the previous question.
Yeah.
I think Björn-Ola made a very important point on the role of states, and I think that dovetails into what is the changing role of the private sector, of corporations, because at least from my kind of lay point of view, what you're seeing is the creep of politics into the economy. You see, I think, wholesale sectors being seen as sort of national, and I think there's no alternative to global supply chains. But I think what states, in terms of their politics and their policies, are probably going to orient themselves more towards is looking for like-minded partners, sort of the different kinds of alignments that actually serve and are in alignment with the political kind of the politics of the day, the geopolitics. And I think that's going to be a distinction from the previous decades where, politics and economics were sort of seen separately. So in this respect, I think this is going to influence companies' decisions as well, I think, in terms of where they source, how they source.
Okay. Well, that's a bit of a hopeful message, though, isn't it? The conclusion. Okay, so I'm running slightly delayed here. It's almost 11 o'clock, so I'm just going to thank this panel for a great discussion. I wish we had another hour. Maybe we will eventually at some other point. But thanks for participating, and I'm just going to hand over to Anna and Åsa. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So hi, thank you very much for attending this, and we will certainly see a world that will change after this corona crisis, and hopefully we'll see a willingness to spend not only to restart but also to move our economy away from being pollution dependent. We will definitely have reason to talk more about this. And thank you, Mattias, for moderating and guiding us through this complex and interesting field. And again, thank you, Björn-Ola, Jiayi, and Karl, for your useful perspectives and insights to this. And we look forward to the coming 4 years of Mistra Geopolitics.
And also thanks to all participants for your time and your interest, and also for the questions. Just want to let you know also that in the autumn there will be more joint Swesif Mistra seminars focusing on specific industries at that time, textiles and fashion, as well as the market for recovered materials. So we hope you will also be interested in these seminars. Wish you all a good day. Thank you.